met John Margetson 25 years ago while I was courting my wife, Shirley, and she said, could we go make contact with my cousin's husband, John Margetson? And I said, of course we could. And on that particular trip, we gave him a look at the Capitol at Annapolis. And we've been good friends ever since, as we have relatives, obviously, on both sides of the ocean, Shirley and me. John brought a book to me to us that he wrote about the public school, which means the private school he attended. And it had one of the great headmasters who was the leaders of civilizing, is his term, the schools that they have in England. He, after that, then went to Cambridge University, but for just a few months before he was drafted in for national service. Served his 2 years. The last 6 months was in the Palestine under the British mandate, and he finally returned to Cambridge University and got his degree in anthropology and archaeology. That might be thought of as the first chapter of his career. Then he joined a highly prestigious avenue of service in Great Britain called the Colonial Service. They really had outstanding people going to there, and it's a shame it almost is non-existent now. He served in Tanganyika for 10 years out in the bush. So the last 2 years he was brought in and made secretary to the governor of that area, Lord Twining, who was considered the last great governor paternal governor of Africa. Third chapter comes along, and he joined in 1960 the diplomatic service, was posted in the Netherlands briefly, became a writer to the Secretary of State in the British cabinet, Mr. George Brown, and then he was posted finally out to South Vietnam. In Saigon, he was brought back to London and was one of the very few chosen people to help keep the relations and activities of the British cabinet working right, called the Secretariat of the British cabinet. And he also did work with NATO at that time. Finally was sent back to Vietnam to become now an ambassador at Hanoi. I've heard him tell some of the stories of he and his wife could only have private conversations by making a point to go out where they knew there were no microphones and there have a chance to talk in an honest way with each other. He came back after that to be named the ambassador to the United Nations from Great Britain. Marvelous having him here in New York during that period, and that's when we had him down to Johns Hopkins University. And finally, his final posting was in the Netherlands. And I must say I've never seen anyone more beautifully clad with the uniform expected of the embassy than what he wore at Netherlands, and he was rewarded as soon as he retired by being made a knight by the Queen of England. Fourth chapter is his real love now, and this is music. And he's chairman of the board of the Yehudi Menuhin School of Music, also part of the joint committee, the Royal College of Music and the Royal Academy of Music. I got details on all these because they all sound the same to me, but they're all separate. And chairman of the Royal School of Church Music. And furthermore, he serves as a trustee of the Fitzwilliam Museum at the University of Cambridge. I'm pleased to give you, only after I tell you that there's a slight change in the title that was published. Yes, all his consciousness of his career will be there, but he wants to focus on what he says, my life when U.S. policy has played a major part in my work. He's interested in these U.S. and British relationship, first in Tanganyika, second in Micronesia, and finally in Vietnam. So I look very forward to hearing what he has to say.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I learnt today that a distinguished governor of Virginia said that the first thing he had been taught in politics was never to deny anything good that was said about you. And so I remain mum about that incredible curriculum vitae which David gave just now. Thank you very much, David, for that. Now, Mr. Chairman, I'm, of course, honoured to have been invited to speak to you this evening, and particularly delighted the opportunity to revisit Baltimore, a city which I admire, particularly for Johns Hopkins University, with which I have some valued personal links. I'm not quite sure, after listening to David Cormack, what the title of this lecture is. It rather reminded me of a remark of that great classical scholar, Sir John Shepherd, who was Provost of King's College, Cambridge. And he said, "It doesn't matter what title you announce, it's always the same lecture." In his case, it was always the glories of 5th century Athens and the beauties of Shakespeare. Those will not be my subjects tonight. Rather, I would like to consider some aspect of Anglo-American relations. But before doing so, I think I must say two things. Ambassador Sykes, who was a very popular and very successful American ambassador in London fairly recently, wrote an excellent book, which some of you may have read, called Over Here, a book about Great Britain. And in it, he quite naturally says things that are rather critical of Britain, and rightly so. But he prefaces the book by saying, "I am an Anglophile." So I think I should really do the same thing. If any of you think that anything that I'm saying tonight is critical of your great country, remember that I am really a lover of the United States and its people. Secondly, everything that I say is, of course, entirely my own view of things. It's one of the pleasures of retirement, and I've been retired now for more than 12 years, that you can really say exactly what you jolly well like. Now, as David Cormack said, I'm going to narrow the subject down really to three parts of the world in which American policy played a great part in my life and what I did. Now, after I left Cambridge University in those far-off days of 1950, that's half a century ago, for heaven's sake, I decided I wanted to go to Africa for all sorts of reasons. Africa was then a remote and rather mysterious continent. It was very largely ruled by imperial powers, France, Belgium, Portugal, and the United Kingdom. Like many young men, I had strong political opinions. I was immensely proud of the British Empire, but I thought that rightly its days were numbered. I myself wanted to play a part in the next stage of decolonization. Quite apart from the great dominions of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, which had been independent members of the Commonwealth for years, India, Pakistan, Burma, and Ceylon, or we now call Sri Lanka, had all reached independence just after the Second World War. But the African colonies, and there were many of them, Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Kenya, or we now call Kenya, Tanganyika, and so on, there were so many of them, were in general at an early stage of constitutional development. Ever since the Durham Report, that's the report of Lord Durham, who was Governor General of Canada in 1839, which the report laid the foundations of Canadian nationhood and self-government. Ever since then, there had been what I would call an idealistic element in British colonial policy. This looked to development of empire, not just economically and socially, but politically. Every colony should in time become independent, and policies of training in every conceivable sphere, medicine, engineering, government administration, agriculture, all this should be geared to that specific end. This was perhaps, in large part, a lesson Britain had learnt from the experience of the American War of Independence, to go before it became too late. There were, of course, many reasons for the development of the idea that empires should be dismantled, the rise of liberal opinion in Western countries, not least in Britain itself, the rise of nationalism, and the influence of President Wilson at the Versailles Conference after the First World War. Then there is what I would call the missionary factor, dating back to the end of the 18th century, when the new missionary societies and the evangelicals in the Church of England combined to exert enormous influence to end the slave trade. Now, that little bit of history gives you the background against which I chose as a young member of the British Colonial Service to go to Tanganyika. For those whose geography is a bit rusty, I should say that if you look at the map of Africa, Tanganyika is about halfway up on the right-hand side, just below Kenya. The center of Tanganyika is dry savanna, over which roam, in those days, large quantities of wild animals. At the edge of the country are the most beautiful mountains, of which Kilimanjaro is probably, certainly, the finest. And it is, of course, the highest mountain in Africa. 3 degrees from the equator, but always at its summit, snow-clad. Tanganyika is a large country, 4 times larger than Great Britain, an 1/8 the size of the United States. The population of 8 million included 80,000 Asians and 20,000 Europeans. The vast majority of Africans lived in rather primitive huts and existed on subsistence agriculture. There were lots of primary schools, but only about 10 secondary schools in the country in those days. Africans had begun to enter the one university in East Africa, Makerere, but none had yet completed their degrees. Outside the capital, Dar es Salaam, there were no tarmac roads at all. Primitive, you may say, but in general, a contented country with excellent race relations. The American John Gunter, in his remarkable survey of Africa in 1955, just after I went there, entitled one chapter, The Wonderful World of Tanganyika. Now, I had chosen to go to Tanganyika not because of its colorful and remarkable tribes, nor because of its topographical beauty. I'd chosen it because, within overall British policy to work for the self-government and eventual independence of the colonies, Tanganyika had a special position as a trusteeship territory of the United Nations. Now, before the British took it over, at the end of the First World War, Tanganyika had been a German colony. It had just started to develop, in fact, when the First World War intervened. Then the British started to develop it further, and of course the Great Depression and world slump ruined the markets for Tanganyikan products. Then when the world economy revived, the Second World War started. So the serious and intensive development of Tanganyika really only began in 1945, at the end of the war. And I would say, actually, that for various reasons, which I needn't go into, the process only really got into its stride in 1950. Now, looking ahead, it's worth remembering that Tanganyika became independent in 1961, just 11 years later. The overall policy or strategy was laid down clearly and succinctly by a great governor of the country, Sir Donald Cameron, in 1925. He said, "We're here in Tanganyika on behalf of the League of Nations to teach the Africans to stand by themselves. When they can do that, we must get out. It will take a long time, but everything we do must be based on that principle." Now, the special position of Tanganyika as a trusteeship territory under the United Nations intrigued me as a young man. As a young and rather naive person, I suppose, in 1951, I thought the dual responsibility to the British government and through them to the United Nations would be beneficial. We can consider that further later on, and that is where the United States is involved. I left for Africa after 1 year of an introductory course at Cambridge, where we studied law, Swahili, that's the lingua franca of Tanganyika, tropical agriculture, forestry, elementary engineering, particularly how to build simple roads, bridges and buildings, and colonial history and policy. All this seemed very theoretical at the time, but when I reached Tanganyika and started to work under a very experienced district commissioner, all that really became of invaluable assistance to me. I must say, I have never worked so hard in my life as during my 10 years there. It was the perfect life for a young man. You could do things which really mattered. You took enormous responsibility. It was remote, it was adventurous, and above all, you worked with and for a wonderful African people. Don't mistake me, I'm not starry-eyed. Tanganyika had its shares of rogues and criminals. Now, the aim, as I said, was very clear, to get the country ready for self-government and independence. But the great question remained, when should that be? My own thoughts at the time would have led me to answer, when we have enough Africans with sufficient experience to run the country reasonably well. And this, in fact, would have accorded, incidentally, with the policy of the United States, which in 1953 was expressed by Mr. Henry Byroad, Assistant Secretary of State, as follows. And here I quote, "To support evolutionary self-determination for all peoples as rapidly as possible. The granting of complete freedom to those who were not yet ready for it would serve the best interests neither of the United States nor the free world as a whole." At that time, from 1953 to 1960, the American representative on the Trusteeship Council of the United Nations was Mr. Mason Sears. He was a political appointment of President Eisenhower, not a career diplomat. For over a decade, Sears had been a member of the Massachusetts state legislature. He had a great deal more than the traditional anti-colonial prejudice of a typical American. He had observed the rise of nationalism in Africa and adopted what I would call a crusading spirit to do everything in his power to help all colonial territories, and particularly Tanganyika, for which, of course, he had a responsibility as a member of the Trusteeship Council, to help them all to independence as rapidly as possible. He wrote a book on the subject after he retired, and the title of the book, Years of High Purpose, gives some idea of the zeal with which he pursued his aims. Inevitably, he crossed swords with the British, and he crossed swords with his own Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. Sears portrayed the attitude of the State Department at that time as quite unnecessarily conciliatory to such countries as Britain and France, simply because the United States needed help in the Cold War. To quote from Mason Sears himself, "To run contrary to this preponderant world feeling of anti-colonialism seemed to me as if the American people were being unnecessarily obliged to swallow a natural pride in our past in order to protect ourselves from some highly debatable danger from the Soviet Union. To describe the security threat of the Soviet Union in 1954 as highly debatable gives a very strong impression of naivety on the part of Sears and a somewhat myopic concentration on colonial affairs with little or no concern for the wider picture. A particular worry about Africa, shared by the United States and Britain, was that the granting of independence prematurely to a colony might well in some cases lead to chaos. The Russians were past masters at fishing in troubled waters and could create serious difficulties for the West. And this, of course, is exactly what happened in the Congo, previously the Belgian Congo, only some 6 years later. Now, the key date in this particular story is 1954, when the third United Nations visiting mission, of which Mason Sears was a member, arrived in Tanganyika. Just 1 year before that, a young man, Julius Nyerere, who had completed his degree at Edinburgh University in 1952, founded the Tanganyika Africa National Union, TANU for short. Now, the interaction of TANU and the visiting mission was crucial. Mason Sears found in TANU, small and ineffective though it was then, the independence movement he needed for his vision to become a reality. TANU, on their side, found in Mason Sears a bridge to the international stage of the United Nations and beyond. The report of the visiting mission, dominated by the radical views of Sears, provoked a very strong reaction by the Tanganyikan and British governments. Perhaps I can quote Judith Listowel, the historian of Tanganyika and friend and admirer of Julius Nyerere. The report contained, she said, all jumbled together, true statements and ill-advised criticism, straightforward accounts and inaccurate slanted information. But what really put the cat amongst the pigeons was the demand that a date should be set immediately for Tanganyika's independence, or at least, and I quote, a timetable of the steps to be taken in consultation with the people towards self-government. The report treated with skepticism the British effort to create a multiracial society, and finally it backed the TANU demand that Tanganyika be granted independence in 25 years. Now, you may well think that in the light of history, 25 years was rather generously long. But the trouble with setting dates in this sort of way is that the process provokes counterbids, and that is exactly what happened. In 1957, Chief Mariali of the Chaga tribe in Tanganyika asked the Trusteeship Council for 15 years. Julius Nyerere countered with 12. The particular worry of the Tanganyika government was that setting a date would undermine existing institutions, particularly the chiefs and local government, that it would cause civil disorder, such as demonstrations and refusal to pay tax, and would damage the inflow of capital we badly needed for the economic development of the country. The fate of the report was interesting. The chairman of the visiting mission, Mr. Reed, a New Zealander, refused to sign it. And the United States government ordered Mason Sears to repudiate the stand he had taken at the council and to state that his views presented in the report did not accord with United States policy. But the damage had been done. The enormous publicity in Tanganyika given to the mission, its report and subsequent debate at the Trusteeship Council, and particularly to the visit of Julius Nyerere to the Trusteeship Council in New York, all this was something which really stirred up the country. It was, in fact, the most important factor in transforming TANU, the nationalist movement, from a small association confined to the capital, Dar es Salaam, to a mass movement covering the whole of Tanganyika. There we will leave Mr. Mason Sears, except to mention an incident described in an autobiography of a friend of mine who in 1960 was Provincial Commissioner of the Lake Province in Tanganyika, the scene of a massive cattle raid at the time and of potential war between the Masai tribe and the Sukuma tribe. And probably some of you may know the Masai. They are renowned chaps for going to war if they have a possible chance to do so. Mason Sears, then on the final visiting mission of the United Nations Trusteeship Council before independence, he turned up to see what was actually happening. The author states, "I took my guest, Mason Sears, back to the camp to tell him with maps what was actually happening, after which he said to me quietly, 'What are all these people going to do where new administrators have gone?'" This comment, the author adds, however difficult to answer tactfully, was at least good for morale. Mason Sears recorded the whole incident in his book, Years of High Purpose, but somehow made no mention of his remark to the Provincial Commissioner. Now, I'm not suggesting that it was simply because of the United Nations, and in particular the report of the visiting mission, that Tanganyika reached independence in 1961. Political life is much more complicated than that. But it is certainly arguable that without that report, we could have gained 5 precious years in which to prepare that country for independence. Julius Nyerere received enormous encouragement at the United Nations when he visited New York in 1955 from many delegations, including, of course, the Soviet Union's. African expectations in Tanganyika, which hitherto had been realistically low, were now raised immeasurably. The example of Ghana, which Nkrumah had ruled since 1951 in partnership with the colonial government, and which reached independence in 1957, raised expectations even further. The mood was, if they can do it, we can do it too. The fact that Ghana had hundreds of university graduates from 3 generations in all professions, including Ghanaian district officers recruited in London, was seen as irrelevant. Tanganyika, I should add, at that time had but a handful, and that's no exaggeration, only a handful of graduates. In this atmosphere of high African expectation of independence just around the corner, with the constant threat of unrest, demonstrations, and civil disobedience, thinking in the Tanganyika government and in London changed rapidly. Tanganyika achieved its independence in 1961. It had not been much of a struggle. By the end, TANU had been pushing at an open door. Had we got the timing right? In one sense, obviously not. We had not had the time to train and give experience to enough Africans to run the country reasonably well. For example, at the time of independence, I believe there was only 1 African trained doctor in the whole country. The history of post-colonial Africa I consider to be a very sad one, in terms both of stable and good government, and in terms of human rights. Most governments have imposed one-party rule, abused human rights, and suppressed civil liberties. Many governments are now brazenly corrupt, as well as absurdly inefficient. Tanzania, as of course Tanganyika is now called, Tanzania has in some respects though certainly not all, followed this pattern. Julius Nyerere himself, who died last month, a much revered mwalimu or teacher of his people, never enriched himself. He lived a simple life. But such was the mismanagement of the economy that despite the fact that Tanzania received more aid per head of the population than any other African country, it still remains one of the very poorest. In political terms, I believe we were right to leave when we did. I myself left Tanganyika in 1960, just before independence, satisfied that we, the British colonial administration, had done our very best in the very, very short time available to prepare the country for independence. I was proud to have played my part, but I left filled with foreboding, and today I am saddened and disappointed at its history since independence. Let me now, as a postscript to the colonial experience in Tanganyika, turn to a small but interesting colonial experience I had at the United Nations in 1983 and 1984. On this occasion, the roles were reversed. The trusteeship territory was not Tanganyika, but Micronesia. The administering power was not the United Kingdom, but the United States. And finally, it was I, and not Mason Sears, who was president of the Trusteeship Council. Although Micronesia was the trusteeship territory administered by the United States for 47 years, I would excuse anyone for not knowing where it is. So let me just say that Micronesia is a collection of some 2,000 islands, only 98 of which are inhabited, in the Western Pacific, north of Papua New Guinea. The United States was entrusted with this old German colony at the end of the Second World War. The Americans had fought very bravely to capture these islands from the Japanese. By 1965, there were increasing demands for local autonomy. In 1977, after 8 years of negotiations, President Carter announced that he intended to adopt measures to terminate the Trust Treaty by 1981. In fact, it was not until 1994 that the largest island, Palau, achieved independence. Why was it that it took 47 years to reach that point? Compared to my experience in Africa, the islanders were well educated, had a reasonable economic infrastructure, had more developed educational and health provisions than anything I'd seen in Africa, and seemed just as able to stand on their own feet. The answer was, of course, the security of the United States and the Western world. Incidentally, the very factor which Mason Sears was not prepared to allow for in Africa. The crucial importance of Micronesia lay in the testing range for nuclear missiles in the Marshall Islands, one of the archipelagos in Micronesia, and the necessity to ensure that the Soviet Union did not use the anchorages of the islands as a warm water base for its Eastern Fleet. Now, this problem was eventually solved by what was called a Compact of Free Association, under which, in general terms, the Micronesians agreed that the United States would continue to be responsible for the security of the islands and would retain their rights to missile testing, to storage and transit of nuclear weapons, and would retain 2 military bases. All this in exchange for very large sums of development aid. If the compact were agreed by the 3 component parts of Micronesia, then independence would follow. Plebiscites were held in all 3 areas of the country, and I led missions from the Trusteeship Council at the invitation of the United States government to observe 2 of them. It's certainly not every day that you get invitations to visit such remote and beautiful parts of the world. So I accepted with alacrity. The mission concluded. The plebiscites had been excellently run. They were fair, and the results represented the wish of the people. I wrote the reports myself, and I was pleased to have helped to further the independence of Micronesia. And whatever the ghost of Mason Sears might have said, Micronesia finally made it to independence 33 years after Tanganyika, the last in the race after all the other trusteeship territories. Come to think of it, I really begin to wonder whether either Mason Sears or Cabot Lodge, his boss at the United Nations, had even heard of Micronesia. Cabot Lodge says in the preface he wrote to Mason Sears' book, "I remember the day when Sears came to me to say that all the areas were exercising self-government and that the work of the Trusteeship Council was ended. And that day, recalled by Cabot Lodge, was in 1960. There were still 34 years to go before Micronesia finally got independence and the Trusteeship Council concluded its work." Now let me turn to the final country where my work was dominated by American foreign policy, Vietnam. I realize a foreigner such as myself must tread very carefully when discussing this subject in the United States. It is understandably a most sensitive subject, and differing opinions are strongly held. My contribution today does not pretend to be academic history. It is only some rather tentative conclusions reached on the subject after working both in Saigon during the Vietnam War and in Hanoi after the war was over. I record them today simply because I suppose it may be of interest for some of you to hear what a foreign observer made of it all. It's hard for us now to recall the depth of emotion which Vietnam elicited in the Western world in the 60s and early 70s, particularly amongst the young. The subject was discussed and debated endlessly in Britain. Thousands of people demonstrated in London. The Foreign Secretary at the time, Michael Stewart, went to Oxford himself to explain to the students the basis and the thrust of British policy on the subject. A courageous move, which was influential at any rate with the more thoughtful students. It was in that atmosphere, just after the Tet Offensive of 1968, that I was sent to Saigon as head of the political section of the British Embassy. As you well know, the first task of a diplomat concerned with political reporting is to find out as accurately as possible what is actually going on. Perhaps I could just make a comparison between Hanoi and Saigon, my experiences there. In Hanoi, after the war, the Vietnamese surrounded you metaphorically with a wall. It was the most secretive country in the world. It made China, by comparison, during the Cultural Revolution, an open book. The Vietnamese were not allowed to talk to you, except for a few what I would call show persons who made the rounds of the embassy National Day parties. Official sources, such as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the government-controlled newspapers, were totally inadequate and almost totally misleading. You couldn't leave Hanoi without permission from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and that was only granted very rarely and after a considerable tussle. Now, by contrast, in South Vietnam during the war, there was no shortage of information. Everyone seemed eager to talk to you. The difficulty was to know what to believe. You could be briefed at the drop of a hat by the American or Vietnamese military in Saigon or in the field. I saw more flip charts in a month than in the whole of the rest of my life. The Cords organization, CIA, JASPOW, and the American Embassy were all enormously helpful. Then you had your Vietnamese friends in position of importance, and finally you had the enormous press corps, which I shall speak about later. I should say at the start that it seemed to me quite clear that the American presence in Vietnam rested on a firm moral basis. The United States wished to enable the people of South Vietnam to choose their own political way of life and not to become part of a Vietnamese communist state against their will. One has, incidentally, to remember that about 1 million Vietnamese fled from the north down to the south in 1954 after the Geneva Accords, specifically for that purpose. Now, one of the great propaganda successes of the North was to portray Ho Chi Minh as a benevolent Father Christmas, and the regime there as an enlightened one, pure and revolutionary, building a veritable heaven on earth. The truth which I saw for myself in Hanoi from 1978 to 1980 was very different. The Vietnam, the post-war unified country of North and South, was a Stalinist state ruled as totalitarian states all are by fear. There was no freedom of religion, no freedom of speech, and no concern for human rights. The so-called re-education camps were an appalling feature of the country. Thousands of Vietnamese of Chinese racial origin in the north were, when I arrived in 1978, being forced abroad, even though they had actually played their part in the war against the South. Thousands more in the South were stripped of their possessions and forced to pay in gold for what in practice was their deportation. The deaths at sea in small, overcrowded boats, unseaworthy boats, were numbered in many thousands. Finally, you may remember that Mrs. Thatcher called a conference in the summer of 1979 at Geneva to consider the whole problem of the so-called boat people. What I'm saying is that regardless of how others perceived North Vietnam, the vast majority of those in the south of Vietnam knew the North for what it was, and for that reason wished to defend themselves against a particularly nasty regime. What went wrong? It was certainly not for the want of trying on the part of the United States. When I was in Saigon, there were more than 500,000 American servicemen in that country. The expenditure on the war, both in military terms and in supporting the civil administration and economy of the South, was prodigious. Above all, there was the incalculable sacrifice of American blood. Of course, there were many mistakes. For example, the military concentration at first on firepower as the means of dealing with an insurgency. I'm not saying that firepower is unimportant, but one needs to remember that by the end of the war, it was the North who launched conventional ground offensives. Not surprisingly, the United States was sometimes reduced to the moral level of the North in order to combat the insurgency. The extremes of the Phoenix program provide one such example. Amongst the many difficulties the United States faced was the constant and insoluble problem of dealing with corruption. Corruption constantly and consistently lowered the ability of the South to prosecute the war efficiently and effectively. There was also the psychological difficulty that once the Americans had deployed their ground forces in 1964, the South Vietnamese, more and more considered the war as primarily one between America and North Vietnam. It had ceased to be their war. Then there was the problem of political instability in the South, the murder of President Diem, the military coups, and strangely enough, amongst certain Vietnamese in high places, a deep resentment at the American presence. that they were dependent on the United States. The Americans, in my view, did all they could possibly do to counter and solve these problems, but there were two major ones which were fundamental. The first was geographical. In the late 40s and 50s, the British had defeated a strong communist insurgency in Malaya. They had the huge advantage the country was a peninsula. The sea guarded both its right and its left flanks. But in Vietnam, there was an open flank to the west, Cambodia and Laos, through both of which, quotes, neutral, unquote, countries, North Vietnam poured troops and equipment. The American advance into Cambodia in 1970 and the subsequent attempts to cut the Ho Chi Minh trails in Laos were never successful enough to secure that flank. One of the main British protagonists of the Malaya campaign, Sir Robert Thompson, visited Vietnam on several occasions at the invitation of the American authorities. His major piece of advice, contained in his last book, went something like this. This cannot be a short war. You have got to hold on for years until the North is exhausted. Only then can peace be made on acceptable terms. Now, there were many reasons why the Americans could not hold on for years. The chief one, which is also the second of the two fundamental difficulties the American government faced, was public opinion in the United States. I remember at that time in Saigon reading a dispatch by Lord Castlereagh, the British Foreign Secretary, just after the Napoleonic Wars. The dispatch was not in the archives of the embassy. We didn't go back as far as that, I hasten to add. It was my own copy. But what Castlereagh said was this: he, the king, must well know that if embarked on a war which the voice of the country does not support, the efforts of the strongest administration which ever served the crown would soon be unequal to the prosecution of the contest. It's all there in a nutshell. Our embassy in Washington at the time in its reporting often emphasized the majority in the opinion polls which supported the war. I, in Vietnam, was much more concerned at the growth of the minority in the United States which opposed it. It was the minority figure which was the one to watch and which was decisive. Of course, public opinion in the United States was itself influenced by many considerations, but among them was the reporting of the media in Vietnam. The enormous international press corps there contained, in my opinion, some of the best and some of the worst journalists in the business. In talking to the American press corps, which I did constantly, I got the impression that most, but not all, were strongly prejudiced against the war. Their reporting tended to reflect this, giving little credit to positive developments and magnifying all the American failures they could possibly identify. Their reporting, one has to say, also reflected a determination to counter the consistently over-optimistic and positive spin of so much official briefing. This was perhaps excusable, but the counter consistently went too far. I was interested that one of the very best journalists there, Maynard Parker of Newsweek, he was then the head of the Newsweek office in Saigon, but subsequently became editor of Newsweek, wrote in an edition of Foreign Affairs a few years later that the press at the time had underestimated the American military achievements. All this had, as you know better than I, a profound effect on public opinion. Even more profound was the television coverage of the war, exposing the United States for the first time to the horrors of war, reported instantaneously and in horrific detail. There was one more problem which I believe affected the American will to fight a long war. This was drugs. Drug-taking in the army had a most serious effect on both discipline and morale, and therefore on the effectiveness of the army. It was, if you like, both a cause and an effect of demoralization. It probably only became a serious problem in about 1969, by which time the gradual withdrawal under the Vietnamization program had already been planned. But it served to reinforce the correctness of that fateful decision to Vietnamize the war. We all know what happened. But did the United States lose the war? Plainly, the military war fought by the Americans was not lost. We have to remember that the United States Army, under the Vietnamization program, withdrew long before the North Vietnamese launched their offensive, which finally brought them to Saigon. But was the political war lost in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia? When I was dealing with Indochina in the Foreign Office in 1971, all sorts of people, members of parliament, journalists, heads of organizations concerned about the war, and church leaders would call on me to discuss Vietnam. When we had finished talking about the war, I used to say, if you want to see where the future really lies in that part of the world, look beyond Indochina. See how the countries known collectively as ASEAN are doing. The Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, and Indonesia. They may not be as perfect as some of you might like, but their economies are growing as their confidence and experience increases. There is some freedom, and there is some respect for human rights and democracy. Very few people at that time bothered to look at those countries. They were mesmerized by the Vietnam War. But, and this is my point, without the time which the war Vietnam bought, those countries would not have been able to grow politically and economically to what they are today. I'm not a believer in the pure domino theory. It simplified far too much a very complicated process. But I believe that the Vietnam War created a sort of protective wall behind which the non-communist countries of Southeast Asia were able to grow in stature, even to the point, long after the war had ended, when they felt able to agree to Vietnam joining them as a member of ASEAN with absolutely no fear that Vietnam could harm them. Then look at Vietnam itself. I remember reading in Hanoi in 1978 the latest draconian measures the Vietnamese government had imposed on the South to extinguish any significant economic activity not run and owned by the state. If I remember right, no one will be allowed to own a business which employed more than 10 people. My reaction, which I remember very clearly, was to min it on my copy of the report. If I know South Vietnam, it will take much more than that to crush the entrepreneurial and enterprising spirit of those people. A few years must pass before we really know who won the war. Today, we see Vietnam slowly removing the Marxist bonds with which they attempted to shackle the economy. Foreign capital from the West is at work, playing its part in building a new country, a very different country from the vision of Ho Chi Minh. As with China, we must wait some years to see if the increased economic freedom is followed by increased political freedom. And remember, those years during the war have left memories in the South of some freedom and democracy. For example, I myself remember in 1970 the election to the upper house, the Senate in South Vietnam. It was a free election, properly run, with no disturbances and with a convincing result. the anti-President 2 slate of candidates won the election. It was headed by a fine man who happened to be a friend of mine, Vu Van Mao. Now that seed, a fair democratic election, and many others, can lie dormant for a long time. They will, I believe, finally germinate. When the Vietnam War was raging, my superiors in the British Embassy in Saigon took a cautiously optimistic view of the outcome. I took a cautiously pessimistic one. I did so because, Watergate or no, and Watergate still had some 3 years, was still some 3 years ahead, I did not believe the United States would wish to continue to prosecute the war for much longer. And the process of Vietnamization, which was then being planned, would leave South Vietnam at such a disadvantage militarily that it would inevitably have to surrender. That is, as we all know, what happened. But for the reasons which I have outlined, I believe the enormous American effort did in fact pay off. It did so not so much in Vietnam, although the story there is far from over, but in Southeast Asia. The freedom, the prosperity there represent a real American victory, more important perhaps than the one which eluded them in Vietnam itself. One great benefit for me which emerged from my time in Saigon was the number of American friends I made there. Friendships blossom in difficult circumstances, and some of the friendships continue to this day. Only this summer, I was staying with the person who was my opposite number in the American embassy in Saigon then. I may say that in the United States Embassy, there, and in other organizations in Vietnam, I met some of the finest people it has ever been my good fortune to know. Which brings me to my final point. Throughout my diplomatic career, I have always found a particular pleasure to work with members of the American Foreign Service. That goes for my years at NATO and at the United Nations. When I was ambassador in the Netherlands, the American ambassador there was, in my opinion, one of only 3 ambassadors who was closely in touch with Dutch affairs and really knew what was going on. He was, incidentally, a career ambassador. I sometimes wonder whether this country, just like my own country, really appreciates its foreign service and the high professional quality of those who represent it abroad. Let me therefore end by saying, a great country needs and deserves a great foreign service. The United States has one, and it is for the good, not just of the United States, but for the world as a whole, that it should always continue to have one.